Can't hear. I can't hear. I can't.
Can you hear?
I can't hear.
We cannot hear you.
and to always be accountable to the indigenous people wherever we may work. I personally want to thank the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral Adawandurung peoples whose lands I'm currently working on and from and promise to ensure my actions are guided by the aims and the spirit of truth and reconciliation. So thank you very much. Today we have with us three wonderful guests. We have not online connecting from University of Kentucky. We have Jackie Murray, an associate professor of classics and African American and Africana studies in the modern and classical language, literatures, and cultures department at the University of Kentucky. Her areas of research are Hellenistic and Latin poetry, race, ethnicity, and antiquity, and Black classicism, especially the reception of classics in African American and Afro-Caribbean literature. Jackie was the recipient of the American Academy Rome's Prize in 2012, the Margaret Titus Fellowship in 2017, and the Center for Hellenic Studies Fellowship in 2020. She has published several important articles on various aspects of Hellenistic and Latin poetry and race and the classics. Most recently, Poetically Erect Again, the female-oriented dildo humor in Herondas, Mimiam 6, and Race and Sexuality, Racecraft in the Odyssey. Her monograph on Naicus, the Poetics of Controversy in Apollonius Argonautica is under contract with Harvard University Press. With Rebecca Futo-Kennedy, she's writing a textbook called Understanding Race in Antiquity, and with Elena Giusti and Rosa Aduhar, she's editing the Cambridge Companion to Race and Classics. On my left, we have Jonathan Montpetit. He is an award-winning digital journalist at CBC Montreal and a William Southam Journalism Fellow at Massey College. He has spent the last several years reporting on Quebec politics and has written extensively about the province's new nationalism, its secularism debates, and the rise and fall of far-right groups. Before joining CBC, he worked for the Canadian Press, covering the war in Afghanistan and the earthquake in Haiti. He holds graduate degrees in political science from the London School of Economics and McGill University. Online, our other guest is a professor at the University of Toronto, Katherine Blouin. She's an associate professor of ancient history in the Department of Historical and Cultural Studies, University of Toronto on the Scarborough campus, and classics at the University of Toronto on the St. George campus. Her work centers on socioeconomic and environmental history with a focus on ancient and particularly Roman Egypt, as well as on the ethics and decolonial entailments of antiquity-related fields. She is notably the author of Triangular Landscapes, Environment, Society, and the State in the Nile Delta under Roman Rule, published in 2014 with Oxford University Press, as well as the editor of the volume The Nile Delta, History from Antiquity to the Modern Period, forthcoming with Cambridge University Press, and co-editor of Handbook of Classics and Postcolonial Theory. Her upcoming monograph is entitled Invented Alexandria. It explores the history, historiography, and reception of free to early Alexandria in Egypt. Dr. Blouin also is a co-founder and editor of the platform everyday Orientalism, which she will probably say more today. How about we start by asking our journalist in residence, how about we start defining our terminology? What is the far right? Why is the far right interested in the classical antiquity? And what's its appeal to their ideology and their political agenda?
So defining the far right is notoriously difficult. One of the reasons why that's the case is because it's a tremendously fluid space, political space, where groups emerge, form, exist for a few years, and then disappear. Certainly this is the case in Quebec, and I think it's turns to be the case across North America and the Western world. When I try to define the far right, I try to do so in a way that defines it as a movement that is somehow distinct from more mainstream traditions of conservatism. So it's not like Burkean conservatism. It's not even like Reagan or Thatcherite conservatism. So it is somehow distinct from those kind of schools of thought. And it is one of the ways it is distinct from those schools of thought, I think, is its focus on culture, civilization. It has, for a conservative school of thought, is a kind of unusual relationship to globalization. It's very suspicious of globalization. It is tends to be very populist in its orientation, and I think in some respects, it also has a very complicated relationship with democratic institutions. So, whereas in Europe, you tend to see far right groups form political parties, engage in elections, like we see in the Front National, now the Ralliement National, or the AfD in Germany. That tends to be less so the case, or at least until recently, had been less so the case in North America, where certainly, like in the Republican Party, where you get far-right elements trying to colonize or trying to take over or capture elements of the Republican Party. So it's a bit kind of a different approach there. And of course, the far right becomes a bit more easier to identify the further or more extreme they get. When you get neo-fascist groups or neo-Nazi groups, I don't think there's any, we don't need no difficulty identifying those as far-right groups. Groups kind of very overt with their racism. I think one of the things that's happened in the last 30 or 40 years or so, though, is that certainly in Europe, far-right groups have tended to avoid the language of race, knowing that the language of race is very problematic and doesn't get you anywhere with voters. So they have replaced the language of race with the language of culture and the language of civilization. And I think that kind of gets at the second part of your question. For far-right groups, I think civilization is one of the key conceptual units of how they build their ideology. So the idea of the West versus the East, a Christian European West versus Muslim or some kind of other East. Of course, this was a distinction so central in the years after 9/11 to far-right discourse, to anti-immigrant discourse. And so I think in terms of classics, they draw on the classics to help them define this civilizational unit, what the West is. In order to define that, they really a lot of these groups reach into that canon to kind of fill out their ideology.
Thank you. And it would be interesting to hear from our online guest, and maybe we can start with Professor Blouin. As an historian and a papyrology, how do you see this misappropriation taking place? Do you think you can see it both inside and outside of the classroom? And do you think, as a historian, do you have a duty to differentiate between good ways and bad ways of teaching history?
Thank you, Vittorio. Okay, this is a big question. A phenomenon that doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? In the context of Canada, and in the context of the United States as well, this appropriation takes place among far-right groups in a context where we live in a world that in many ways is also based on the misappropriation of the classics. So the so-called classics, that is an idea of what the ancient Greek and Roman past was about. So there is already kind of a direct link, right? So, and this is something I just want to emphasize from the start, and I want us to keep that in mind, that these are not movements and appropriations that are necessarily foreign to people who distantiate themselves and are uncomfortable with these groups. The conquest and the land grab of the Americas by the Europeans was based on this idea of terra nullius, that if the land was not peopled by Christians, it was nobody's land, right? And the people who came and took the land and interacted with indigenous people read them through a lens that involved their own classical education, so their own knowledge of ancient Greek and Latin authors writing about the barbarians. And similarly, they reenacted here in this new world, so they called it, this civilizational project that they saw as a continuation of this Greek and Roman past. So if you walk around Toronto, the classical, this fantasy of the white classical world is everywhere. And so I think this is very important for our conversation today, because I think for many years, there was this idea among many Canadians that what we were saying in terms of neo-Nazi and far-right appropriation of antiquity in the US and in Europe was not happening very much here. But now we're meeting today right after the so-called freedom convoys, where there's been quite a bit of expressions of these appropriations, both in the street, and I can show some slides later if you want, and also in one of the league donation Excel sheets to the convoy. Oh yeah, so that's my slide. I'm sorry, this is a bit long. I want Jackie to talk as well, but for those watching the slide, maybe you can see a white building with a colonnade in all of these pictures. So that was taken during the first weekend of the so-called Freedom Convoy. And this building is the Lillian Massey building, which is the home, among other departments, of the Department of Classics. So to me, to have this gathering there was extremely powerful. And I'm not saying it's just because the police blocked Queen's Park, right? They couldn't go to Queen's Park they couldn't go to Queen's Park itself. So it was not necessarily premeditated, but I think this is a strong symbol. And if we change slide, you can see three blurred pictures with a black flag. On the black flag, you have this expression that has been really appropriated by far-right group, molon labe, which is a Greek, kind of a fictional Greek expression, actually, which means come and get them, or come and grab them, which refers to the Spartans. So there's also a Spartan helmet with that. And you see the same imagery on some of the hoodies that were worn in Ottawa by some of the protesters of the convoy. And so we have here this appropriation, which is fed by transnational connections among all these people who are also getting a lot of information online, and which in many ways is also related to, I think, a certain failure of our education systems and of a lot of academics to occupy the public space and make sure to do all we can to convey the importance of knowing history. If people would be historically literate, they wouldn't be as prone to buy into these fantasies. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Blouin. It would be interesting to see if Professor Murray has, well, of course, something to add onto this, but also if she can tell us whether there is a difference in the misappropriation and how it happens between different disciplines within the field of classics. Do you think literature is being misappropriated differently than, for example, philosophy or history or archaeology? Is there a difference in how these far-right groups or anyone who wants to affiliate with these far-right groups are misusing these different branches of the classics?
I think that in general, the misappropriation is more or less, I would say it's more or less the same, though some aspects of classics are more amenable to misappropriation. So for archaeology, because you have tangible objects, and there's the use of more scientific discourses in archaeology. Mythology is used rampantly, so a lot of the literature is used. And philosophy, of course, because in much of the philosophy, particularly Aristotle and Plato, you do have discussions about the ideal state and different kinds of hierarchical structures, how slaves should be treated, and different kinds of things. So I'm not really sure I could say that the various disciplines are being treated differently. I think they're just, it's a smorgasbord approach to how they're going to appropriate it. And it's all available to them, but some aspects are more accessible. So if it's got imagery, it's much more accessible to their public audience. And if it's a narrative, it's also easier. I'm thinking about a recent post by Curtis Dozier on his Pharos website, where it's in February. He had a post about last August he had a post about mythical appropriations of Greek myth in the far right, and there, you can see that they're using the image of Europa. The rape of Europa is somehow becoming a symbol for the invasion of Europe by the dark hordes. So resuscitating these arguments of the early 19th century about the vanishing of the white race, this kind of stuff. So I think a lot of it is available. I don't think it matters what the discipline. It's actually the cachet or the authority of the discipline and the various aspects of the discipline that gives it its power. It's the fact that we've held it up for so long as sort of the foundation of Western culture that this just fits into their argument really well.
Thank you for that. Just a quick follow-up on something you said. What is the appeal? Like, why go to the classics? Like, why not go to any other topic? Like, why? Like, if we want to play this twisted game, like, if I want to justify my political agenda and I want to justify a political agenda that has some sort of fascination with far-right groups, why choose the classics? Why no other groups of like why no,
well,
like,
it's not just classics isn't the only discipline that's having this problem. Medieval studies is having a problem. Germanic studies is definitely having the problem. So it has to do with the way in which classics in particular was already being used, especially in the colonial period, as Professor Blouin was pointing out, was already used as a way of justifying imperialist discourses and justifying creating a white supremacist vision of the world, that basically ethnocentric European vision that then becomes a white vision of the world. And classics actually was used as part of that discourse. And so, and there's a glorification of the past. There's a tendency to glorify the past, especially in conservative thinking. And this, if you go back to, say, the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, you find out that they're actually saying exactly more or less the same thing, right? Without any pushback or any problem, because that was the way people saw the world. So they don't have to go too far in classics to find actual scholars that are saying things that are coherent or consistent with what they're saying. They don't have to go too far. And so I think that's part of it, is that classics has an authority because it was sort of like the discipline to get into college. It was a discipline, in America in particular, it was a discipline that distinguished between the elites and the middle and lower classes. I would imagine the same is in Britain. And so it's a way in which it's already part and parcel of the way classics has been manufactured and produced for even us. It's students and then scholars. So that's what I would say is why the cachet is there.
Thank you.
If I can just add a little bit onto that, many far right groups appropriate other, as Professor Murray was mentioning, appropriate other symbols that would be less familiar to us. So if you look at a lot of Scandinavian far right groups, it's or the soldiers of Odin. Like, who the hell is Odin? It is not a symbolism that is very familiar with people in North America. But when far right groups appropriate the symbolism of the classics, these are things that are readily recognizable to a lot of people. And so I think it's an important part of their quest for legitimacy to kind of appropriate symbols that most of us will be familiar with. And so it doesn't look like, when you see it in a far right poster or something like that, when you see, a bust of Athena or something like that in a far right poster, there's not that kind of, it's not shocking for us to see that. The content is shocking, but they're able to kind of use symbols that are familiar to us to kind of draw us into the more sinister discourse.
Thank you. And I do sort of have another question for you, which comes off from something Professor Blouin was saying about the public space. As a journalist, on the one side, we have academia, and on the other side, we have this sort of strange fluid idea of what we call the public. How do you think, as a journalist, you can fit between these two areas? Do you think that journalism has no space and it's the job of academia to come forward and interact with the public? Or do you think journalism has some sort of role bridging these two areas?
Yeah, I definitely think journalism has a role bridging the two areas. And I definitely think, when I think of my work as a journalist, I don't see myself in particular, or any of my colleagues, as kind of distinct from the public sphere. We are part of the public sphere. Our work creates the public sphere. And I think this maybe the same thing could be said of academics as well. But I do think one of the important roles of journalists is to allow the expertise of academics to speak to broader audiences. So journalists, I don't speak Latin. I don't speak ancient Greek.
Neither do I.
I hope your department doesn't know that. But so I haven't done that work to kind of decode the appropriations that are going on here, to fully kind of understand that that context. But Professors Murray, Professor Blouin have, and so my role, part of my role as a journalist, is to be able to to use their expertise, bring it to the public, bring it into the public sphere, and to allow to kind of create a critical discourse. Use their work to kind of unpack the racist messages that the far right is using. And what's really exciting about what's happening in the classics, and I would love to hear the other panelists talking about this, is that you see more and more scholars engaging in public-facing work themselves. And so, the idea of the academic locked away in the ivory tower, just, and I think this is a stereotype that was particular to the classics in general. You're sitting in front of a text that is 2,000, 3,000 years old, and no one else in the world cares about what you're doing. That is really no longer the case, or at least starting to no longer be the case within classics. And you're seeing more and more scholars orienting their work to what is happening now and making that link themselves.
That's great. I mean, let's hear from our academics online. Are you stuck in the ivory tower, Professor Blouin, or do you engage the public? What is your take on this?
Well, I guess others could answer this question better than I. But for me, no, I'm not in the ivory tower. I'm a first generation academic, first of all. I'm a French Canadian settler. My trajectory is not, I have a lot of privilege as a white scholar, as a white woman, but my trajectory is not typical. And so I think for all these reasons, I've always felt like I did not really belong. But more broadly, it's become increasingly important for me to disseminate the knowledge that I have. To me, what I value the most about my work is the fact that I can teach people. I love telling stories. I think historians tell stories with true events, and I'm paraphrasing a French historian here, Paul Venn. But I'm not into hoarding my knowledge. I'm not interested in spending 30 years just hoarding my knowledge with 20 people. I'm not saying my colleagues like this, but personally, that's not my jam. So I find that the classroom is a public space. I find myself very privileged that I can teach undergraduates in Scarborough, most of which will never become classicists. We don't have a specialist in classics in Scarborough, but it doesn't matter. I can pass on knowledge. And then if they are engaged in what I'm saying, they're going to pass it on. They're going to talk with their family about it. They're going to talk with their friends about it. And I'm trying to do the same on Twitter, and I'm trying to do the same with Everyday Orientalism. So I definitely, I don't think I am in the ivory tower. And I think many of my colleagues, including Jackie, feel the same.
Professor Murray, feel free to jump in. What's your take on this? What is the role of an academic to fight this phenomenon or to acknowledge this phenomenon? Is there more work to be done?
Well, yeah, I agree with both of you that the role of the academic is changing and becoming more of a communicating to the larger audience. I have my feet in the ivory tower, and because my Hellenistic stuff is clearly the 1,000-year-old text that nobody else cares about work. But then doing more of the reception work that I've been doing in terms of the reception of classics and Black classicisms and teaching, as Professor Blouin just said, is actually where I think I'm having more of a public facing, because in my class on Black classicisms, the point is for the students to reflect on classics as how it's normally presented to them as a founding fathers of America, and then say the architecture of American architecture, all the ways in which it's bound up in American identity, how the founding identity of America is bound up in classical imagery, and then look at the ways in which other groups have the groups that are marginalized have been pushing back on that, but still engaging with classics. And so this then opens up the ability to look at this phenomenon of the alt-right or the far right appropriating classics as a part and parcel of this whole discourse of how this classics football is being passed around, and having them think about it. And it's important, I think, for students who are going to be the next generation, as Katherine is pointing out, or may not become classicists. By the way, Katherine, I'm from Scarborough, so classicists do come out of Scarborough. But
This is great.
but the point is that they might not become classicists, but they may become journalists, they may become writers, they may become artists, and it'd be good to have them thinking about how these symbols are really live in their world, and not just this stuffy old stuff that they learned in a mythology class or a Latin class, etc. But it's actually about the world around them, right? And how that actually works, and how they can actually change it, or have something to say about it.
Thank you for that. And I want to stay a bit more on the role of academics in this sort of like battle against misappropriation. And maybe we can start with Professor Blouin. Do you think that scholarship and scholars in the 1800s, 1900s, 20th century, they have sort of laid the groundwork for this misappropriation to happen? Do you think that we've lost some contact with what classics really is because white nationalism is so embedded in the discipline that we maybe forget about the interaction of what we call the classical world with other culture, for example, Africa, Asia? And I'm thinking, for example, of a famous book called Black Athena, which basically was working around this line that classic never tends to forget about this interaction because it is embedded in white nationalist ideas.
Vittorio, you really ask a big and important questions. I will maybe focus on the first part. I kind of sense that for the Black Athena reception, Jackie is way more competent than me. And I have a few things to say about the first part. I think it is very important to make a distinction between classics as a package, as a discipline, as a concept, as a story, and what the ancient past was actually like, what it looked like, what it was about, who were the people, the many, many stories there. These are kind of two things, okay? Obviously, the scholarship of classicists from the Enlightenment period on set the foundation of what the discipline is today, and also kind of nourished these far-right misappropriation. Classics was both a tool and a byproduct of European colonialism. It was kind of a mirror that anchored this idea of a European hegemony and right of conquest into an imagined direct link with ancient hegemonies, that is Athens and Rome. And so, as I said in my first intervention, this is the mental fabric with which our landscape in North America was constructed. This is the landscape, the historical and mental landscape through which land was taken all over the continent and a genocide was committed. So for us to see, when we talk about classics, I think it's very important to make a distinction between this, which is way more about, in many ways, we could argue that this package of classics is way more about modern European imperialism than and also now North Atlantic imperialism than it is about the ancient world. And then we have what the ancient world was about. And this ancient world was way more diverse, way more complex, and way more embedded within other fields that appeared at the same time as classics, but were kind of categorized as Oriental. So we can think of so-called Oriental studies, Near Eastern studies, Egyptology, for instance. Yeah, so that would be my answer.
Thank you. And Professor Moray, I think Professor Blouin put the ball in your court to talk about the reception of Black Athena. Maybe you could also introduce for our public or non-specially public, what is Black Athena and why it's sort of it's an important turning point of the topic that we're covering here today.
Well, Black Athena was it's a 3-volume set that was written by Martin Bernal, who's a professor at Cornell of Chinese studies, but he wanted to do a kind of re-examination of the ancient world and thinking about, or sort of debunking actually the long-standing, well-held view that, well, there wasn't really much contact or influence at all between Africa, particularly in Asia, on the Greeks and the Romans. In other words, they sort of the idea of Athena popping out of Zeus's head, fully armored, is the image he's working with for classics, or not classics, Greek and Roman culture popping out of the Mediterranean without any influence. Of course, that's a little bit of exaggeration on his part, but I think the main issue with that the main line that's valuable out of his work was the point that there's a definite strain within 19th century, early 20th century classics that probably goes all the way back, where there was a denial of their own participation in, or maybe not even denial, I would say, but how they were involved in constructing this white imaginary of the ancient world, that the ancient world was a white world where Greeks and Romans are white. And it's this coming up at the same time that there was race science creating the white race through that kind of discourse. And so anyway, so Bernal was trying to go against that, and trying to argue that no, the ancient world had a lot more interaction among the different populations of the Mediterranean. But of course, the way in which he framed it made a lot of classicists at the time take it as an attack on them, and then there was a lot of reaction to it, very, very hostile reaction to it, as basically claiming that he was an Afrocentrist, which is the African American or Black African appropriation of classics in a different vein. And so Bernal is actually falling in a genealogy of scholars, Black scholars in particular, who actually wanted to push back on this narrative about the ancient world being an all-white space. Now, the Black scholars wanted to push back against that narrative because a main line in that narrative is that there were no civilization coming out of Africa that was Black in origin, right? And so, because Black people by nature are incapable of civilization, and so any civilization that we see on the African continent, say in Egypt or Carthage or whatever, that cannot possibly have been the product of Black people. And so, already even before the abolition of slavery, etc., Black writers were pushing back on this narrative. So Bernal is sort of in that genealogy of scholars, Black scholars, even though he's a white scholar. But let's say the main issue, though, is that they all seem to have accepted the idea that either the ancients were Black or white, as if the racial categories that exist today or that existed in the 19th century were somehow the same racial categories that existed in the ancient world. And that's also part and parcel of the problem here. So anyway, so the fact is that they're all part of this argument about who does classics belong to, what, and also it's sort of racial discourse about the black, whether or not various characters in the ancient world were black or white, all these different kinds of contentions. Bernal sort of stirred that up with his book.
Thank you for that. I have a quick follow-up on what you just said, especially about this idea of the connection between, this fact of the connection between whiteness and classics. In another talk you did at Villanova University, you said that when we study the past, we don't have to identify with it. So we don't have to be we don't have to become like Nazi if we study Nazi Germany. But and I completely agree with that. But if we take into account something else that has been said in a very debated article that was published in the New York Times about saving classics from whiteness, the scholar who published this article, Professor Padilla, said something very interesting. It says that whiteness it's not something which is extrinsic to the idea of classics, but it's something that's intrinsic, and it's in the very marrows of classical scholarship and classics as a subject. So I guess as someone who would like to finish their PhD in the next 2 years, why study it? Why?
Well, that is a question that people really should ask themselves. Why study it? I do think that, well, the assumption that we have to take away from what Professor Padilla Peralta says is not that classics is a fixed, unchangeable entity, right? But that it can be changed. It can be transformed by the people who participate in it. So the product, classics that was produced in the 19th century is the classics that was produced by the people at that time. And the overwhelming majority of scholars at that time held white supremacist, racialist views. So of course the discipline will reflect that, and especially since it was also an exclusionary discipline that did not acknowledge people who were not white, not or in any way. So that adds to that. But if the discipline is going to continue to have these exclusionary practices of making it difficult for women of color, scholars of color, indigenous scholars to actually study, to get jobs, to write, to publish, etc. If the discipline is going to continue to do that, then sure, it should be burnt down, right? Because then it is part and parcel of this perpetuation of whiteness. But the discipline doesn't have to do that. Classics does not have to be an instrument of whiteness. It can be. It certainly has been in the past, but it doesn't have to be. And so it can be something else. It can be, more of a way of exploring humanity, exploring what it means to be the old age-old question of what it means to be human, or looking at various societies and different ways in which people have created social structures, etc., that not necessarily are good. Part of the problem is the assumption that, oh, we are supposed to glorify these people as if they were somehow, I don't know, ancient gods that can do no wrong, right? And therefore we should admire every single thing about them and even try to imitate them. And I think that that's part of the problem we have is this tendency to look back and say, oh, I want to be Achilles. I don't know, like, which then if you actually really read about Achilles, you might be a little bit more concerned about what is going on. So I think that's the problem. For me, that's the problem, is that the tendency to identify with, and which we are encouraged to do and have been by the way in which our culture has appropriated classics through monuments, through education, everywhere, right? You're sort of encouraged to identify, if you're white especially, to identify with the ancient Greeks and Romans. And when that, I think that is very dangerous approach to studying any culture, especially if it's not your own.
Thank you for that. I mean, I do have like plenty of other questions, but probably it's time to open it to the public here in person or online. If you have any questions, that's your time to shine. Yes. Hi.
Hello. Am I heard okay? Awesome. Thank you so much for that enlivening talk. My name is Christine, and I have one of those dreadful questions about solutions, because I know we aren't going to solve this within the end time of the panel, but much has been made in alt-right politics and responses to it about that byword de-radicalization. And I'm wondering, and I hope this isn't building too much on Vittorio's previous question and the previous really enlightening response about the role of classics in like re-education and repair. But is the response, if de-radicalization is a route in terms of how these images and histories have been misappropriated, is the response to, is there a role for classics in de-radicalization pedagogy, or even responses to how, as John alluded, the public sphere increasingly structured by digital disinformation and actors that have incentive to misrepresent images if they'll circulate? What role does classics play in terms of like tangible, even policy-driven responses to this like serious issue of the way that this misappropriation of imagery can be used to implement like violence? Sorry for that easy question.
Thank you, Christine. I might be mistaken, and probably like call me out if I am wrong, but maybe Professor Blouin is the person who should, one of the person who should address this topic.
I think we all have thoughts on this. And as far as de-radicalization is concerned, first of all, this is not an easy question, Christine. Thank you so much. It's an important question. I think Jonathan might be better for the de-radicalization part. But the role I think we can do is our job, which is educate. I think one thing I like to do in the classroom is just explode tropes, right? So whenever I teach Intro to Roman History, I will ask week 1 students to tell me what words come to their mind when they think about the Roman world. And all the cliches you can think of are on the blackboard. And then I go through the term and I embed in my introductory course material that goes against the grain of these cliches and disrupts these narratives, and also shows students how this ancient past is very much alive today. It is not actually ancient. It's not really ancient when you think about it. And so at the end of term, I ask the same question to the students again. And it is extremely satisfying as a teacher to see the changes in the blackboard. Not that I'm not talking about the Colosseum, gladiators, and Spartacus, but there's much more variety in terms of themes, and it's much more problematized. So this is something I think all of us who teach can do. And something else we can do is try to engage with public-facing scholarship and community outreach a bit better. And the third idea I would have down the line, but this is a more ambitious aim, which I don't think we're going to have success with the current government in Ontario. But I think we really need more robust historical training in university, not in universities, but pre-university. It is appalling. It is in line with broader cuts in the humanities at the university. Sadly, this is a trend. all across North America and Europe, I think, right now. But this historical illiteracy means that most of us walk through life without even having a sense of where we're coming from, of what the present is made of what made the present. And this is very dangerous. And this nourishes this misappropriation of the classics by far-right groups.
Thank you for that. Jonathan, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, the question of de-radicalization, tends to be treated as a psychological or a social worker issue. It tends, as far as I know, tends not to really involve a revisiting of people's educations in that sense. I think what Professor Blouin's comments suggest is that the role of classics and classical education is really perhaps as a prophylactic, is as if we know about the past, we'll be less susceptible to to these wild misappropriations of it, or these probably, I don't know how much harm the film 300 has done to
much, definitely much,
a classic. But I mean, the amount of times that you see references to Sparta in far right discourse without any engagement with the actual state of Sparta or the Persian Empire at the time, it's crazy. So I think, education, and I think the other interesting thing is, I'm somebody who kind of also had a bit of a liberal arts education, and Professor Murray hinted at this, is just the extent to which even those of us who are not in the far right, we tend to use references to the classical world to kind of make ourselves look smarter, to kind of we kind of hold it out as an easy way to legitimize an argument, to invoke the beauty of democratic Athens is kind of a standard rhetorical move, for the lazy. So I think we have to, those of us who engage in writing and engage in kind of public thinking have to kind of be careful in how we use the past, and we have to, make sure that we're we're not kind of being lazy and hagiographic in our invocation of the ancient world.
Thank you. I think there are some online questions. Okay, there is a question, and the question is the following. I'm studying the connection between alt-right politics and retellings. Do you think the wave of retellings published recently are a response to a rise of alt-right politics or a coincidence? Do you want to take it? Should I?
I would suggest Professor Murray take that one if I can.
Professor Murray,
just given her own background in especially that kind of in the alt-right politics.
If the person means retellings of the classical world in, say, on television, etc., I'm assuming that that's the question. Then there's actually, has been there's been like some kind of conscious effort to try to mitigate some of this recently, very recently. So in the Netflix show Troy Follow the City, where they have a multiracial cast, that attempt at casting was deliberately thought of. I don't think it's 100% successful in terms of getting at the representing the ancient world in any way, but the idea of like breaking up the stereotype of Blacks in the ancient world as always being slaves, that is I think that's consciously being done as an attempt to sort of push back on some of the alt-right appropriations, but again, we're not in control. Classics are not really in control of whatever Hollywood or these other entities are doing, and oftentimes a lot of us don't want to be consulted on these things because then we get misquoted or whatever, and you're forever connected with this, with whatever it is that they produced. So yeah, so I would say some of it is conscious, for the most part. If it really does seem to be bursting a stereotype, it probably is conscious. Someone probably spoke to a colleague or something and got a little bit better of concern there. Yeah.
I think we have time for other questions. Are there other online questions? If then other person in the room with questions? I think there are.
Hello, thank you so much for this. It's been wonderful. So the field of classics is not the only field rooted in classics.
Yeah.
I come from an astronomy background where we often say we're the oldest field of sciences, where then we point to Galileo and say, look, he made telescopes, and it's all rooted in this sort of classical history. And while there has been some facing towards the ways in which we've rooted the discipline in classics, for example, naming recent sightings like Oumuamua after non-Western deities, it's definitely an accounting that is much quieter and less visible than the one that's happening now in classics. So how can disciplines beyond classics face up to their sort of misappropriation of the classics?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for that question.
Okay,
Jackie, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to you could come in after, but I was going to say that I know that in medieval studies and certainly in Germanic studies, I have colleagues that are in Germanic studies. There is an late antiquity. There's a lot of concern in those disciplines right now, and so it's not just classics that is being inundated with this, and I'm trying to respond to it, but also other disciplines. I know that at the next medieval history conference that they're going to be having, they're definitely going to have panels that are addressing these appropriations. So there's work being done. It's not like they're not, the scholars are not aware. Katherine, did you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the U of T is lucky to have Hilding Nielsen in astronomy, who's been working on indigenous astronomy. I think, Jackie, you were with us when in my course on indigeneity and the classics, he came to give us a wonderful kind of master class introduction to indigenous astronomy. I think this question points to something very important, which is the need for classics department and classicists to, let's say, continue valuing reception studies as much as
It's a good end.
is easier. It's easier. It's not true. So I think this is important. And the second element is classicists like Jackie or Daniel Padilla Peralta and many others are doing a great job at radiating and building bridges way beyond the other disciplines that you think would be an obvious fit, right? So I think we need to continue doing that. We need to be more curious in terms of how what we do speaks to others and what others do speaks to us. So it's not just medieval studies or biblical studies. I think we need to be much broader, including this kind of artificial wall between the humanities, social science, and so-called pure sciences.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and I see in the public here that there is.
Thank you for this kind of an hour of very wide-ranging discussion. We started with this idea of the far right using civilizational discourse and the idea of West versus East. And I guess I would want to emphasize that the same kind of discourse is not just happening in North America, and like within this kind of new Cold War, the civilizational discourse is also very prevalent, and the kind of ethno-nationalism is prevalent in China. And when this topic came up for the Massey dialogue, I was thinking about scholars in China who has been kind of translating and teaching classics through that modern European lens of scholarship. And I'm very curious, but I guess we don't have time to talk about this. But there are Chinese scholars who are kind of reading classics through Heidegger, through Leo Strauss, some of those modern kind of conservative philosopher and kind of and also who are really invested in classics and wrote all these very important books. And what we see is kind of this generation of scholars who are translating in the 80s, they have this conservative turn in the recent kind of 10, 15, even 20 years. And it really feed into kind of the current, in terms of whether it's this larger kind of great power conflict or and they are kind of also using their knowledge in the classics, and they're also kind of combining it with kind of Confucian philosophy, kind of using Confucian philosophy and kind of using it for like political ideology. And there's a very strange blend of all these things in these scholars' works, and they're still very invested in classics. They're not kind of antagonistic to the Western intellectual tradition, but their training in this kind of was blend in this kind of mixture of things that and all these feed into this conservative turn, and also feed into this kind of civilizational struggle that that is becoming kind of China versus West and that. So I guess I'm both interested in like the earlier history of far right ideology, if we want to say that, with kind of the Third Reich and all that, and their engagement with classics and just all these very strange loops that landed in our present moment.
If I can say something about that.
Oh yeah, that's
So
for
I
you,
have
Jackie.
yeah. So I have taught classics in Taiwan for up to before the pandemic for the past 6 years, and I have to agree that because we get students from because it's at Furen University in Taipei, and we would get students from China who were coming to learn Greek and Latin, and but it's interesting that you're right that the way in which classics is the discipline of classics is sort of seen and sort of curated, I would say, for Chinese audience in China and in Taiwan, is that it does focus heavily on the sort of uh, conservative readings of classics, and largely, I think, because of the aid. There's the Chinese government is actually not, as you said, not hostile to classics. They're actually kind of promoting it because in terms of sort of in order to understand the West, they think about it in those terms, and then also at least that's how my Chinese scholars, my Chinese colleagues in Taiwan and Beijing would point it out. Then they're worried about it a lot. They're kind of concerned about. Seems a little, a little bit much, but also the students themselves seem very interested in these conservative philosophies, largely too because say Furen is a Catholic university, and so you get a lot of interest in classics via the Catholic route, which of course is going to be largely conservative. And so yeah, so there's definitely a worrying trend there because appropriations of classics, say through Heidegger, etc., are coming through, but not with the, say, critical lens of thinking about, well, this is Heidegger, right? And that there are some problems also that he's connected to in terms of, you know, dangerous ideas, so like cultural ideas that he had. So yeah, so I'm very have the same kind of worry that you present, because I have very fondness for teaching in Taiwan, and I really like the classics. I like the idea of classics in Asia, but again, with the way it's going on in China, it's a little concerning. Yeah.
Professor Blouin, I don't know if you're still there, if you have anything to add to this.
No, I agree with what Jackie said.
Okay, thank you very much. Then, well, let me end this dialogue by thanking Massey College, the principal of Massey College, Nathalie Desosier, the staff, the technical staff, our wonderful speaker, Jonathan Montpetit, Professor Blouin, and Professor Murray, and our audience, both in person and online. Thank you very much. It was wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.